Good morning, this is Heather Hoffman, and today I have a card that I used some distress crayons paired up with some gesso, just something recently that I've been playing for to create kind of a fun stencil background. I'm starting with a panel of white cardstock, and I just have a bottle. I know there's lots of different brands of gesso. This just happened to be the one that I had on hand. I've done this with just an old paintbrush as well, as long as you clean it quickly. For this time I'm just using a palette knife and spreading it out. I'm intentionally not covering the entire panel. I'm just sort of covering a framed in area in the front of it. And then I'm going to pull out two colors of distress crayons. I've chosen a red, which is Festive Berries, and a nice bold orange, which is called Rusty Hinge. And I'm coloring it over the top of that gesso and then just smudging it and blending it around with my finger to blend the two colors together. And I noticed as I put it on, like if it started to feel a little bit dry and didn't really want to blend, I would just go over it again with the distress crayon, and it would just soften it up and reactivate it again so it spread around really nicely. And I'm intentionally also kind of rubbing it off the edges of my area with the gesso. I like the extra texture because it looks a little bit different on just the plain white cardstock than it did on the other. And I of course set that gesso aside to dry really well before I tried to do this. I don't know that you need to leave it that long, but I did probably leave it a couple hours just while I was doing other things and moving on. All right, now that I've got that full background all blended and nice and bright, I've pulled out a reverse confetti leaf lattice stencil that I have, and I'm going to tape that in place from the back where I want it. And then I have just not a super wet baby wipe, just a slightly damp. You can squeeze some of the water out if it's too wet. And I'm just going to go over that. The gesso is going to resist where the distress crayon is, so the baby wipe easily wipes it off a little bit. And I'm just kind of fixing some areas and smoothing some smudges and stuff like that I didn't want. But it's such a fun distressed effect. I like how even where you pull it off, there's still a little hint of color, but it totally fills in. It's kind of a reverse stencil. Instead of putting your color through the stencil, you're pulling the color off through the stencil. And then I'm going to pull out, I have a Unity stamp set called Be Better Birdie. It's part of the Itty Bitty line. And I've already stamped the image from that on a piece of cardstock and die cut it out in a small circle. And I'm going to add my sentiment on a strip of black. I have a little scrap here. Notice it's not trimmed even or anything. I always save my scraps of black because they're great for heat embossing sentiments on. I find I do that quite frequently. And I'm going to use my Misty just to line that up and stamp it with watermark ink. And then I will heat emboss it with white powder. And then once I finished the heat embossing process, sorry, it's a little bit off camera there. I didn't realize that as I was doing it, but I'll add my heat embossing. Once I've completed that, I'm going to trim it down using my paper trimmer. It's kind of just the way that I like usually adding sentiment strips. It's easier to stamp it on a larger piece of paper and make sure you're lined up and even than to stamp it on a strip that you've already trimmed down. Sometimes I do use it, like if I have small strips and scraps, I do that, but I usually prefer to line it up on a larger piece, and it's easier to hold on to and move and adjust, and then I can pretty simply trim it down with my paper trimmer. It all depends on what kind of paper trimmer you have too, but mine has that nice little bar that holds everything in place. All right, and I also, as I did this, I wasn't sure if I needed to put, I know I've heard of some people with distress crayons using some kind of a sealant over the top to kind of hold it in, because you notice how the gesso resisted, and by using a baby wipe I was able to wipe that color off. I don't know if you added water or anything wet, or if you had wet hands, if it might come off again, but after leaving it out to dry overnight, it felt like it was very color fast just by my finger rubbing on it. It wasn't smudging or moving at all anymore. So if you're worried about that, you might want to pick up some kind of a glaze or a sealer, something to put over that. But again, for a card, this felt like it probably wasn't going to be something I was going to frame and put up on the wall. That might have changed how I used it, and I might have needed to cover it up a little bit more. Now also, I made this the size of my A2 card front, and I frequently will go in when I finish my front panel and just trim a little tiny bit off of all four edges. Also take this opportunity to line it up more evenly if I need to. Then I can mount it on a white card base and it'll work perfect. Thanks so much for coming by. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day.